Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Mem Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Tina Lam in loving memory for grandfather Harav Tzvi Aryeh Sender Zichrono Livracha. His Sefer Anochot Shchita, Mekoman Shel Zevachim, takes its title from the parak we begin today. How appropriate. Okay, we're going to get started. I will say the same thing I said last week. Temporarily there was an issue last week, and hopefully temporarily there won't be an issue this week, but we're working on it. But basically the way the Shabbat daf is going to work from now on is that it will be up. Okay, ideally it could even be up on Thursday. So if you want to get ahead, you can go ahead and find it. You can always find it on the calendar, but theoretically it should appear as the next daf. Okay, so today's daf, like the central one, will still be today as of today. Automatically it will switch tomorrow to be today's daf, tomorrow's daf. But it should be able to be found today. It wasn't working the whole before class, so I'll post it after class. And you'll be able to find it. It should appear as the next daf. If for some reason it doesn't appear as the next daf, it might be like a previous one or something like that. You can go back a daf or two and you'll find it. But the Shabbat daf can always be found as of around 8:30 on Friday morning. You just have to, either by the calendar or go to next daf, and you can find the Shabbat daf. Okay, it will not appear front and center like it used to in the old site. Okay, and then that's good because then when you go on the site, you'll be on today's daf, which is Friday, and then from there you can move to the next one. Okay, getting started. And by the way, so you should, again, I will remind you, there's this new calendar feature which allows you to basically go and find the daf based on where the cycle is. It's good to help if you want to ever look ahead, like what daf are we doing on what day, if you want to, for whatever reason, it's very useful. Okay, there's a lot of useful tools. Over time, you'll get to learn them. Another one I was mentioning just before class in the context of the Ta'anit challenge is that we now have a really good feature to learn a masechet. So if anybody wants to learn a masechet at their own pace, you go to learn a masechet, and then you can find this on the homepage. You can find learn a masechet. You sign up for that masechet, and then it sends you notifications for the next daf that you're going to be learning. It's a very easy way to learn a masechet. So if the Ta'anit challenge is too crowded for you, you can't do it in 4 days a week, you can do it at your own pace, as you would like, as you can choose any masechet that you want to learn. It's a very good tool, very useful. Okay. Starting with our daf. Okay, today's daf is a little bit easier than we've been in all those past dafim. We're going to finish up the chapter of Shelo Lishma. There's of Machshavot, Lo Lishma, Pigul, all that, and then we're going to start Ezu Mekoman Shel Zevachim, as you heard in the dedication. So we're going to get started with Rabbi Elazar. Okay, and part of the reason this is a little simpler is what I mentioned yesterday, which is we're now talking about the concepts, right? Not like how it works and all the nitty gritty, but this is kind of the end, and we're looking back and saying, okay, well, let's get perspective on this whole thing. What really is a korban? We started with this Mishnah, L'shem shisha dvarim hazevach nizbach. You need to have this intent. Rabbi Elazar says you don't need to have the intent because if you have the intent, right, you might mess it up. And then we struggled a little bit with what's the connection of Eina Machshava Alecha De'alach Harave, because it only really goes by the kohen. But it seems to be the connection is if it was the owner who had the machshava, then you wouldn't need a t'nai beit din, because if it's your own korban, you're not going to get confused with who's it for, what's it for. But if you're a kohen and you're dealing with 1,000,000 sacrifices a day, okay, 1,000,000 is a bit of an exaggeration, but you're dealing with a lot of sacrifices a day, you could get confused. And that's really what Rabbi Yosi is pointing out. According to Rashi, and I'm just going to review this machloket Rashi and the Rambam because I think it's very interesting. Rashi views them both agreeing, Tanna and Rabbi Yosi, and the Gemara later is going to say this. This is why I wanted to point out the Rambam because I think it's very interesting. But the Mishnah, they both think that the one who's having the machshava is the one doing the avoda, the kohen, or theoretically, again, it could be someone else who's not a kohen who's slaughtering, because the messed up machshava could happen during slaughtering as well. Any of the four main avodot, they both agree. It's just that Tanna thinks you're supposed to have, whoever's doing the avoda has to have a positive machshava, and Rabbi Yosi says, no, that could cause problems because they might have the wrong positive machshava. Better for them not to have any machshava at all. The Rambam thinks, and here I want to clarify a little because I read it more carefully after class, I think he does agree that the t'nai beit din is the same, which is, since it's the kohen doing it, it's going to mess it up, and therefore the beit din said, listen, better off not to have any machshava at all. But according to the Rambam, Tanna actually holds that it's the owner of the sacrifice, and that's why there's no need for a t'nai beit din, whereas Rabbi Yosi says, no, it's not the owner, it's the kohen, okay, or the one doing the work, and that's the root of the debate. Now, what's interesting about the Rambam is the Gemara clearly disagreed. Like the Gemara doesn't go in the Rambam's direction. It's interesting that the Rambam would decide to explain the Mishnah in a way that's different from the Gemara, and that's something that's always important to understand, that the Mishnah could exist, and this is why I brought it. There could be independent commentaries of the Mishnah that don't fit with the way the Gemara read it, right? I mean, all the time with the Yerushalmi reads it one way, the Gemara reads it a different way, and sometimes you can come up with a third explanation. Like the Mishnah can exist independent of the Gemara. Of course, later, everyone ends up interpreting the Mishnah the way the Gemara interpreted it, but the Mishnah itself could have a different alternative interpretation than what the Gemara gives it. So that's important to always know when you're learning. Okay. Amar Rabbi Elazar, with the bottom of the daf, we started with this idea of a chata, which is a very strange concept, that you slaughter l'shem chulin. Okay, so we have lishma, lo lishma. Now we have you do it l'shem, a non-sacred sacrifice. Forget about l'shem, a different sacrifice. That for sure is a problem. Again, how much of a problem depends if it's chatat, right? It's disqualified. But a chatat l'shem chulin is not disqualified. Okay, which is, again, we talked about it a little yesterday about the concept behind it. It's a little hard to understand. We compared it to the min bimino, two things that are the same but different or worse. Like a korban shlamim instead of a korban chatat. Major problem. But to do it l'shem chulin, which is a little more neutral, even though it's not really neutral, it's the opposite of kachim, somehow it works. Although we ended with saying maybe it works, but maybe it works to the extent that it's not disqualified, but it might not be accepted, and the owner has to bring a different one in instead. So now comes Amar Rabbi Elazar, 2 lines from the bottom of Memvav Amabet. Chatasha shachata l'shem chulin kshera. Okay, that's what we just had. Mishum chulin psula. Okay, sounds pretty similar. L'shem chulin, mishum chulin, what's the difference? L'shem chulin is what we had before. I have a sacrifice. I'm about to slaughter it. I know it's a sacrifice, but when I do it, I say I'm doing this l'shem chulin. Why I would do that, I have no idea. But if I were to do that, it wouldn't be disqualified. Again, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, but at least it won't be disqualified. I can go ahead and I have to go ahead and finish the rest of the process. But if I do it mishum chulin, meaning I think it's chulin, I don't even think I'm slaughtering a sacrifice at all. That, we're going to call it in a minute, mitasek. Mitasek is a term we've heard like in Shabbat. You didn't even intend to do the action. Okay, what's the action here? To slaughter. No, you say the action is just to slaughter, but no. When I'm slaughtering a sacrifice in the temple, my action is to slaughter a sacrifice. This time, I didn't even think I was slaughtering a sacrifice. In the first case, I thought I was slaughtering a sacrifice, but for the sake of something else. What that means exactly, again, it's a bit of a question. What it means to think I'm slaughtering a sacrifice for the sake of something non-sacred. It sort of doesn't really work, but somehow they think there's something to that. But here, I'm slaughtering an animal, like for a barbecue. That's not the same as slaughtering an animal for a sacrifice. It's a completely different action, and I didn't even have any intent for the action of a sacrifice. So how do we know this? Well, Shmuel asked Rav Huna the following question. He assumed it was obvious that it was disqualified, and his question is, how do I know that if I did this action by kochim, where I didn't even intend to sacrifice the animal, to slaughter it, but I intended to slaughter for a barbecue, how do I know that it's disqualified? So Rav Huna answers him. It says, "V'shachat et ben habakar lifnei Hashem." Could have just said "v'shachat oto." Why I'd say the ben habakar, the cattle. Ad shchita l'shem ben bakar. You have to have a slaughter for this particular animal, which is being brought as a sacrifice lifnei Hashem. So Amar lei. So Shmuel asked for a pasuk from Rav Huna. He gives him one. What's Shmuel's response? Amar lei zobi adenu hi. That one I knew, but la'akev minayin. In order to say that this is essential, and if you don't do it, it's disqualified, you actually need 2 psukim. I got that first one, but where's the second one? So Amar lei, lirtzonchem tizbechuhu. You have to slaughter them, lirtzonchem, according to your desires, your wishes. So what did they learn from that? Lida'atchem zivchu. It has to be that you slaughter them with intent. Ratzon and intent are similar. Ratzon is desire, intent is also what you desire, your wishes. So it has to be with your knowledge. If it's without your knowledge, it doesn't count. Okay, so that was topic 1. Now we're going to move to the very interesting topic about who is the one who can be mefagel a korban, who can ruin a korban with pigul. We're ending this whole section on pigul and shalom lishma and all of that, the build up to now. Now we finally ask the question which we really wanted to ask on day 1. I know many of you asked that question. Who is mefagel the korban? So, obvious from our Mishnah, right? That was what Rabbi Yosi said. He says it explicitly. Now again, Tanna didn't say that. Right? Tanna didn't say anything. He just said you have to do it l'shem these 6 things. But the Gemara assumes that the Tanna Kama agree with Rabbi Yosi about the principle that it goes by the person doing the avoda, the sacrificial rites. It's just that one thought better off not to do them. There's a Tanai Beit Din, and Tanna Kama didn't hold that way. So therefore, again, as opposed to the Rambam, who thought that was the machlokah between them. Matnitin deloki hai Tana, but our Mishnah obviously doesn't match the following Tana, who holds this. Tanya. Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yosi, Shamati shahabalim mifaglim. First of all, he says in a very interesting way, Shamati, which we hear a lot. It means I heard by tradition that the owner's mifagel. The owner's the one who messes up. Okay, now, how does the owner mess up? Is the owner just sitting in his house while this is going on? Possibly. Although more likely, okay, and here's our map. I didn't bring it for this purpose necessarily, but just to use the map to visualize. I brought it more for things later on today's daf, but here's our map. Okay, the map is from Achon Mikdash. It's an excellent map. It's very useful. Right now we're going to talk about, okay, this is from here, this is the Sha'ar Nikanor, and this is the entrance to the Mikdash. Okay, let's talk about our directions because we're going to need these later. This is the east side, okay, this side. The west, as you go in the room, you get more westward, okay? The Kodesh Kodeshim is all the way in the west. The north is actually, strangely in this map, at the bottom. The south is at the top, okay? North is north, but this is the direction of it, okay? Now, so you're entering from the eastern side facing west, and then you're north, okay? So when you're entering in, your south side is going to be on the left, your north side is going to be on the right. Now, you enter in, you pretty much hit the altar pretty soon after. First you pass through Ezra Yisrael and Ezra Kohanim. So theoretically, the Yisrael could be standing in the Ezra Yisrael, which is right in the entrance area. Right? Sometimes people came there, that's why it's called Ezra Yisrael. They came there and watched their sacrifices being brought. And then the Kohen is here on the altar doing the sacrifice, and you watch it. So you could be having a thought while they're doing this. Okay? Now, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, sorry, I skipped. So he says, Habalim mifaglim. Now, why did we think all along the Kohen was mifagel? Okay, so for this you have to look again at that pasuk of Pikul. It says, okay, in Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 18, Im ha'achol yachel mibsar zevach shama b'yom ha'shlishi lo yiratzeh, right, if you eat from this meat on the third day, which again we said doesn't really mean on the third day, it means if there was a thought about eating it on the third day, Hamakriv oto lo yechashev lo. Who's hamakriv oto? The one who brings the sacrifice. That's what it means. So that's why they thought it was the one doing the sacrifice. Again, the one slaughtering, which could be Kohen, could be not be Kohen, or the Kohen who does the other action. Kabbalah, halakha, and zrika. Those are all times where you could be mefagel. Comes Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yosi and says, no, it's the owners who are mefagel. Now, maybe I didn't say that correctly because there's a lot of the Achronim say that he doesn't mean only the owner. He means, and here there's going to be a range of opinions here, he means that the owner or the Kohen, in other words, in addition to the Kohen or the one slaughtering, who could be mefagel, also the owner could be mefagel. Now within that, there's different opinions as well. This is all not said here, okay? But in addition, there could be other possibilities, like the owner could be mefagel only if the Kohen was silent. But if the Kohen had all the right intent and the owner standing there on the side thinking, oh, this isn't what I'm going to eat this in 3 days from now, okay? Then the owner can't mess it up because the Kohen did everything the Kohen's supposed to do properly. So some people think that the owner can only mess it up if the Kohen was just silent and didn't have any intention whatsoever. Then the owner can mess it up. So there's a big range of what he really means. But the big deal really is, no matter, according to everybody, is that he thinks at least in addition to the Kohen, maybe instead of the Kohen, that the owner is the one who's mefagel the korban, or the owner and the Kohen theoretically, in some combination of the two, could mess up the korban. So that's a unique opinion that we really haven't been discussing because it's an outlier opinion and doesn't really get accepted la halakha, but is what he suggests. He says, now, Amar Rava, my Talmud to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yosi, what's his reason? Damar kra v'kriv. Now, what you really have to know before we read this, and that's why I showed you, is what's the reason for those who disagree? Because it says hamakriv oto lo yichashev lo. So hamakriv oto is the Kohen, obviously, or the one doing the slaughtering. So Rava says, Tamar Kra, there's a different pasuk in Bamidbar Tefav. We're talking about that when you bring a korban, you have to bring libations with it. Bring korban ola. It says, Damarkra v'ikriv hamakriv. It says, v'ikriv hamakriv korbano la'Hashem minchat solet. It's basically saying, if you bring a korban, and you're the subject here, the owner of the korban, you have to bring along with it libations. And what do they call you in this pasuk? Hamakriv. Hamakriv could also be the owner of the sacrifice, the one who's obligated in the sacrifice. So, therefore, he says in Pigul, you could say the same thing. So, Abaye, comes Abaye. We could have ended here, but Abaye likes to do this, and this comes up, this kind of structure in a lot of sugyot, but often there's a few people who do this a lot, and Abaye is one of them. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Kulu Sfira Lahu. All these three rabbis hold the same thing. Okay, what do they hold? Zeh mechashev v'zeh oved, havia machshava. If one person's thinking about something, and by the way, we've talked about before whether thinking is in your head only, or in your mind, in your heart, or it's expressed in words. And there's a big machloket when we talk about machshava here, and machshava specifically in korbanot. Are we talking about it has to be expressed in words, your machshava, in order either, right, if you need the positive to do it, l'shem zevach l'shem this, you have to say it out loud, or it just has to be in your heart, and also whether a pigul machshava that disqualifies is in your heart or in words. That's machloket rishonim. That's not in the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't discuss it at all. But anyway, however we understand machashev, zeh machashev v'zeh oved, havia machshava. So they all three hold in three completely different topics that if one person has intent, but the other person is doing the action, that's considered machshava. Okay, we're going to see it's really the owner of the item that has the machshava, while someone else is doing an action. Is that machshava or not? So let's go through our cases. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, Hadamran. Okay, that one we got. The Kohen's doing the avoda. I'm the owner. I have the thought. It's effective, even though I'm not the one doing the action. Rabbi Elazar ditnan. Hashochet laoved kochavim shchitato kshera. Rabbi Elazar posel. The question here is, if I slaughter an animal for avodah zarah, or actually for an idol worshiper. Now, we don't know what the idol worshiper wanted. I didn't know what the idol worshiper wanted. They asked me to slaughter an animal. When I slaughter that animal, now, is that animal going to become an item used for avodah zarah worship? Should we assume that it is and make it forbidden to benefit from? Because it was an item that's slaughtered for idol worship. So, if I'm slaughtering the animal for an oved kochavim, but they didn't say slaughter this for a sacrifice, shchitato kshera. The shchita is kshera. Why? Because I did the action. I didn't have any intent. Who cares if their intent was to slaughter it for a sacrifice? They didn't ask me to do it for that purpose. Their intent has no bearing on my action. But Rabbi Elazar, and that's who we're looking for, posel. He says this is considered an item that was slaughtered for avodah zarah, because we assume that most idol worshippers want things for avodah zarah, and if his thoughts were avodah zarah, then that affects your slaughter because it's his animal. You did an action; it was his thought. Ruins it. Same idea. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is going to mention the issue relating to Shabbat. So we need a little background. When you carry on Shabbat, let's say you have some dust in your pocket. Okay, right? Often from the laundry, you end up with these little dust particles in your pocket, and you carry them on Shabbat in your pocket, right? Because you walk from public to private domain to public domain. You're not obligated because nobody saves that dust for anything. It's basically garbage. It's not anything anyone would collect for any purpose. So that's principle number one. Let's say it's something like crumbs. Now, crumbs, theoretically, if we had a lot of breadcrumbs, we could use them to make schnitzel if we wanted, or whatever it might be that we want to make. But a few crumbs is not really significant. So both of those things, okay, we're going to read them right now. Klal ditnan, klal amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, kol she'ein kasher latzniya, if people don't generally collect this item like dust, ve'ein matzniim kamohu, or you don't put away that quantity, okay, or I thought of even better, sesame seeds. If I have 5 sesame seeds, nobody collects 5 sesame seeds. What do you do with 5 sesame seeds? They're teeny. So if I carry those out, okay, this isn't what he's saying yet, but that's kind of the basis of where he's going, because we're in the middle of a phrase here, we're in the middle of a sentence. But if it's not something people collect, or it's not something people collect in that kind of small quantity, but if somebody came and said, and put it aside to save, let's say someone decided something about these sesame seeds really fascinates them. They want to save those 5 sesame seeds for whatever reason. okay? Or the dust. I don't know. They want to save dust. So, right, dust could be in a big quantity, okay? They want to do an experiment with it, and they decide they're saving it. And then, ba'achir votzio, and then I carry it out into the public domain. Now, I didn't have any machshava for that. I didn't think it was significant. So here you have a fascinating case, because I take something out. It's not important to me, but it was important to somebody else. This now is an item that has significance, because the owner of it, or somebody put it aside, somebody gave this significance. So now if I carry it, it's a problem. I actually carried something that has significance because someone else gave it significance. It's a very interesting concept. So now it's all the same idea. The person who did the action was not the person who had the machshava, who had the thought, and yet it works. So now we're going to try to figure out, would each of them agree in the case of the other? Okay? Now the theory here is, and they use the language of bifnim and bachutz. Bifnim is in the temple. Bachutz is out of the temple. First of all, I think this language was used on purpose. Instead of saying bamikdash and not the mikdash, or I don't know, they could have said other words. I think they're trying to set up like this pnim and chutz, and this idea as we're ending the first section of Zevachim about the significance of bifnim, like the inside, and even in the temple, the more you get in, right, you get closer to Kodesh Kodeshim. Actually, tomorrow's daf is going to start off all about that. Why, in the first case, in the Ezra Mukaman Shel Zevachim, did they start out with the Par and Seir of Yom Kippur? Because it's done inside. Like that, there's this idea of the inside and how significant the inside of the temple is. So anyway, that's just a bit of a literary connection between this and the next chapter. And obviously there's the Chataot HaChitzoniot and the Chataot HaPnimiot that we've been talking about them, and we call them Chitzon and Pnim, and we call them Mizbeach Chitzon, Mizbeach Pnimi, right? Even though theoretically one's called the Mizbach HaZahav and one's called the Mizbach HaChitzon. I'm sorry, Mizbach HaNechoshet. And, what they're made of. One is, right, the one outside is the Nechoshet and the one inside is the Zahav. Anyway, there's a lot of Pnim and Chutz going on. It's something to think about. And now the Gemara is going to say, in Pnim, what they're going to call, in the temple, Machshava clearly plays a central role. Okay, we have 4 chapters discussing this. We have the pasuk that says it, Lo Yechashev Lo, right, that Machshava is super important. In that case, it's more likely we're going to say someone's machshava then can ruin it, like the owner of the korban. It's much more likely than in these other situations. So therefore, they're going to say, Travayu eat lehu to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi. If you think that machshava of one person is going to affect the machshava of the actions of someone else, in Shabbat and Avodah Zarah, for sure you're going to say it in the temple. But if you're going to say it outside, all the more so. Bifnim, Rashi says it because ikar machshavot bekorbanot ktiva. The main place where machshava is mentioned in the Torah, it's the only place where it's really mentioned clearly in the Torah, and how critical it can be and how it can mess up things is inside. Now it's true by Shabbat. There's melechet machshevet, okay, but that is not to mess things up. That's actually to make it a malacha. You really have to have machshava, and we're going to end with that in a minute. Or 2 or 3 minutes. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, late lehu did travayu. Now we're going to go through. So the other 2 for sure would agree that if the machshava there works, is effective to make you liable, then, or ruin the avodah zarah, or whatever it might be, the animal, then obviously you're going to say it in the temple. But Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, who says it in the temple, late lehu did travayu. Right? He doesn't necessarily agree with the other 2 because the same logic. Maybe he was only talking about in the temple. That's when someone else's machshava, the owner, could ruin it. But outside the temple in these other situations, really not. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, now we go through the cases. The one who holds Shabbat, eat laid, so we know already he's going to hold it by, right, eat laid, he's going to hold obviously by pikul. But what about by avodah zarah? Well, yes, eat laid to Rabbi Elazar. He will hold by avodah zarah. Why? Because hashte b'Shabbat amrina b'avodah zarah mebaye. If he's going to say it's significant enough for Shabbat to be motzi, of course he's going to say it by avodah zarah. Okay, for one reason we're going to see in a minute. Also, you could just say avodah zarah. We're very strict about avodah zarah, right? More so than anything else. I mean, Shabbat obviously we also are, but avodah zarah has a different category. But in a minute you're going to see really why it has to do with this melechet machshevet. Okay, now Rabbi Elazar late to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Who's Rabbi Elazar? He's the middle opinion. If you hold avodah zarah, though, then you're not going to necessarily hold it by Shabbat. And here's the reason, and that's going to be the same logic as the reverse in the previous line. Dilma b'avodah zarah hu de'amrinan ke'ein bifnim. There's two reasons really, which is avodah zarah is kind of like inside. Why? Because what's avodah zarah? It's worship of a different idol rather than worship of God. And there's this comparison between them, obviously a complete opposite comparison. But Rashi even quotes this Gemara from Sanhedrin, which quotes this pasuk, Zovech le'elohim yecharam bilti la'Hashem levadel. Right? If you worship idols, right, you can't do that. Only you can worship God. Right? There's this juxtaposition of the two. So avodot haruuyot lamakom chayabu v'avodah zarah. There's an integral connection. What do you chayav for avodah zarah? If you would do it inside to God and it would be good, that's when we're going to call this avodah zarah. So those two are flipped, right, of the two sides of the same coin. So you might say it there, aval Shabbat, that's not enough. There's another difference, which is Shabbat, melechet machshevet asrat Torah. I said we get back to this and end with it, which is melechet machshevet asrat Torah. The Torah forbade things that are creative actions, that you wanted something to happen. Now, if you carried something out that you didn't view as significant, that's not a melechet machshevet, right? The machshava by Shabbat is central, but central to say you're not going to be obligated unless it's a really good machshava, unless you really intended to do that. So, obviously, the Rabbanan were more strict about things, even if you didn't really want that. But a lot of Hilchot Shabbat is based on this. So there, you might not necessarily say it. Okay, so that was the discussion as to who would say what and what's the order the order that it goes in. Okay, whereas more likely you're going to say it by Pigul, a little less likely Avodah Zarah, even less likely Shabbat. And with that, Hadran alach Beit Shammai, and we start Ezu Mekoman Shel Zevachim. So first, let's talk about this first line, okay? Ezu Mekoman Shel Zevachim, where is the place of the sacrifices? Now, most of these things that are listed relate to the place, but not everything, okay? So that's the first thing to know, and that's why we have a map, because we want to talk about areas in the temple, okay? Where do we do things? And they start with this topic sentence. Kodshe, kodshe. I found out in the Israeli, in the Hebrew Zoom, that is not a really good word for topic sentence, okay? In English, it's very easy. It's called the topic sentence of the paragraph. Hebrew, I don't know, there was a whole debate about what exactly you would call it, and it doesn't seem like there's a good term, or maybe there is and just nobody knew. But anyway, challenge for today to figure out. Kodshe kodshim, right, the best we got was mishpat mafteach, okay, like opening sentence, but it's not exactly the same. So we started with this big topic sentence, which is going to be the topic sentence for the next bunch of Mishnayot. Kodshe kodshim shlitatam b'tzafon. Okay, kodshe kodshim, now, this seems to actually answer the question. Where's the mikoman of Zevachim, especially if we say Zevachim are slaughtering? Where do you do it? In the north. Now, you might remember we discussed this already. Okay, where's the north? So when you walk in, again, you make a right, and there's a three-way debate. Is it just the part, because the pasuk says, Al Yerach HaMizbeach Tzafona, where the Mizbeach juts out, the width of the Mizbeach going all the way to the north. So it's like a kind of two lines on the sides of the Mizbeach. Draw two lines from the edges of the Mizbeach all the way to the northern wall, just that area. And in fact, that's the area. It's called, there's these rings on the ground, and they were used for slaughtering. That really is the ideal area. But there are other people who say you could do it in other places. Like, let's say it's a busy day in the temple and you want to expand out. So one opinion says you could do it toward the Heichal, right? The more you get into the room, the more you get toward the sanctuary. Space is called Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. So on the northern side of the altar, going, but further west, toward the Ulam, which leads to the sanctuary. That's here. Okay, so this whole area. Then you have another opinion that says even from the entrance, from where you come in, the Israel, and going in, you could even do it there. Okay? So those are the three different opinions of what north is. You ask about the Korban Pesach. Okay, we'll get to the Korban Pesach. It's one of the Mishnayot. We'll see what they say about the Korban Pesach. But that's not Kodshe Kodshim. That's Kodshim Kalim. Okay, that's different. That could be done outside because it's Kodshim Kalim. Okay, so now. So that seems to answer our question. Ezu Mekoman Shel Zevachim, we're done. But we're not really done, because then the Gemara starts to go up onto all the sacrifices, and we're going to go through all the different ones. Right? This is said in our davening, and if you don't say it every day in davening, I might make a recommendation that while we're learning this chapter, or the Masechet, if you say it every day in your prayers, I promise you that this will become much more second nature to you. You'll understand. It'll be great review to go through it all the time. So here goes. We're now going through examples. The first question the Gemara is going to say, why did we start with this one? But you'll see in a minute kind of why they start. And now we're going to have a whole list of things, not just Chitatam B'Tzafon, which we know already. It's a little strange why they're reviewing that. V'kibul damam b'klei sharei b'tzafon. You accept the blood also in number one, they add in a sanctified vessel. And you do that also in the north. V'daman ta'un hazaya al bein abadim. Now, where do you sprinkle the blood? They're now going to go through. So, they're going to go through the shchita, they're going to go through the kabbalat adam, they're going to go through the zrika. Where do you sprinkle the blood? Well, the blood of the par and the seir on Yom Kippur that the Kohen Gadol brings has 3 places you sprinkle the blood. Remember? Al bein abadim. You go into, right? Remember, the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh Kodeshim. He goes to the Aron Abrit. Okay? In this picture, you can't really see it, but there's 2 poles that are on the sides that are facing toward the Kohen. Although when I looked in pictures online, it seems like some have them going to the sides, but this clearly thinks the Badim were facing forward, and in between the Badim, he stands facing the Aron. There's 2 poles coming out, and in between the poles, toward the Kaporet, basically, which is the cover of the Aron, he sprinkles the blood. Then, ala parochet. What's the parochet? That's this border between the Heichal, the sanctuary, and the Kodesh Kodeshim. Okay, so there was a curtain there, parochet, sprinkled toward the parochet. There's a machloket on the parochet, toward the parochet. You might remember in Yoma, someone says, "Oh, I was in Rome and I saw it." It's going to be a very famous story in Me'ila. We're going to get there, where he actually is in Rome and he sees it. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, who's, by the way, the one mentioned earlier in today's daf, who had that outlier opinion. He says, "Oh, I saw it, and there were blood stains on it. So it must be they did it on the parochet, even though everyone else seemed to think it was toward the parochet and not on it." Ve'al is something to look forward to in Me'ila. Okay. Ve'al mizbach hazahav. And on here they call it actually the golden altar, which is the inner altar. Okay, that's where you put the blood. And we already know this from a previous Mishnah, matana achat mehem ma'akeh. But if you don't do all 4 placings of any of the bloods, any of the ones that go inside, the ones that go by the parochet, and also the ones that go on the inner altar, you don't do one of them, it's disqualified. Sheyarei adam. Now, what do you do with the remainder of the blood? So now if we look at the altar, again, it's a little far, it's hard to see exactly, but you can see there's a line jutting out here and a line jutting out there. You can see there's a bit of a darker line. So on the western side, again, that's the one facing the sanctuary, and on the northern side, there's a part jutting out 1 cubit, was this base on the altar on the floor. Okay, the altar was very tall. This was just like 1 amma high, and jutting out on those 2 sides. Now you pour this blood, not on either one of them, but on the one that's on the western side. Why? Because that's facing the sanctuary. So that's kind of the more important side. Some people even say it has to be specifically on the part of the base that faces. Okay, you can see the base juts out more than the entrance to the sanctuary. By the way, the mizbeach in this picture, where the mizbeach actually was placed on the north-south line, is a big machloket. Okay, something I believe we dealt with already, and we'll deal with again. I don't remember which sugya it comes up in, but this map, the problem with this map is it only shows one opinion. You can't have a picture that moves and has different opinions. Right? If you were to create this in Canva, I guess, or something like that, you could move it and have different possibilities. So, okay, now we're going to move on. So those are the sprinklings and the extra blood. V'im lo natan lo ikev. And by the way, if you didn't do the extra blood, it's not ma'akev. Remember, we saw there was a machloket about this. Okay, our Mishnah takes one side of that machloket. Some people said the shirayim, specifically in the inner chataot, right, actually is ma'akev, is essential. This opinion says no, this Mishnah. Now we get to the next category. Parim anisrafim, usirim anisrafim. These are the chatat of the Kohen HaMashiach. This is the chatat of the majority of the people. Make a mistake based on the court or with avodah zarah, then they bring the seir. So those could be the exact same list, other than one thing which you should know already, which is shritatam b'tzafon, kibul daman b'klei sharei b'tzafon. Okay, so everything's in the north. Daman ta'un hazaya al. Here's the difference. You don't go to Kodesh Kodeshim. The Kohen Gadol only does that on Yom Kippur. So there's nothing bein abadim, right, up by the Aron. But ala parochet ba'al mizbach hazav. You do have the other scene too, turning out Amabet, although you'll see Amabet is super short. Okay, so don't worry that we're near the end of our time. Matana achat mehem ma'akevet. Okay, only one, any of those hazayot ruins it, same as the before. The rest is all the same. Shayrei adam haya shofech yisod ma'aravi shel mizbech hachitzon v'im lo nitan lo ikev. Okay, again the base, pour the extra on the base on the western side, and if you didn't do it, it doesn't ruin your korban. Elu ve'elu. Now, if we go back to the 2 categories, they have one thing that's similar. Okay, that doesn't really make sense because they have almost everything similar. So why the Mishnah did it in this way is a good question. Should have said, these all have the same thing except this one, that, and that one, that. They could have done this completely differently. And you could say that, by the way, about all the Mishnayot, because every time we get to a Mishnah, we have to compare. You have to look with your finger on one and your finger on the other. What's the word that's different, right? How is this one different? You definitely could have ordered it differently. All of them have this, that, and that, and this differs this way and this differs that way. So, and the truth is the Gemara is going to somewhat ask that when we start. So anyway, Elu ve'elu nishrafina beit hadeshin. Both, all these offerings, it's really, right, it's more than both, because but both categories, Par and Sir of Yom Kippur, and the Parim and Sirim and Nisrafim, all of them, we take the animal out and we burn it outside Jerusalem in this area called the Beit HaDeshen. That we've talked about. So now the Gemara starts off and says, we have a question about this topic sentence. They're basically addressing what I said a minute ago, which is, why don't you just tell us what was similar about everything? Now, you might say maybe only tzafon is similar, but also there's two things that are true for all kodesh kodshim, right? We haven't gotten through the list yet. We're only at the first two. We have to do with ola, chatat, asham, right? We have a lot. So why didn't it say another thing? They looked ahead. Okay, we haven't looked ahead yet, but they all have shchitatam b'tzafon, and they all have kibul damam b'klei shaveh b'tzafon. So why didn't they add that to the list? So they say, what do you mean? The blood of the leper, the kibul damo biyadhu, and therefore shireh. The kohen doesn't have to put it in a kli shareh, he can put it in his hand. And that's why they left it out. Okay, well, that's weird. Why they asked then? They knew there was an exception. So the Gemara says, what do you mean he puts it in his hand? Velo, he doesn't have to put it in a kli shareh? What do you mean? Okay, you're going to be very confused now. Because hakatane leila kaman, it says later on the Mishnah, Asham Nazir, V'asham Mitzorah, okay, the guilt offering of the Nazir and the leper, which is the one we were talking about. Shchitatam b'tzafon, v'kibul damam b'klei sharei b'tzafon. You slaughter it in the north, and you accept the blood in the north. Okay, now it's super confusing. Why they think this was an exception, and now they say it's not an exception. Okay, that's very weird. And then if it's not an exception, it begs the question, why didn't they put it in the beginning and say, all kodesh kodshim shchitatam b'tzafon, there's slaughter in the north, and you accept the blood in the north in a sanctified vessel. So they say the following, and now we're going to understand this whole super confusing thing. Mi'ikaras savur kibul damo biyadhu shireh. Originally they thought that they accepted the blood by hand, and therefore they left it out in the topic sentence. But kevan de lo sagele ela b'kli, but then they realized that you really had to do it with a vessel, okay, which we don't understand why there was confusion about this, but we'll see in a minute. Hadar tanya. So because now they're going to a little bit, I think, modify this answer, although it's a good question, how to read this. This is the way I read it. But what they're saying right now, which I think we're going to be able to add a little something that's going to make it make a little more sense, because they originally thought, which ended up being not exactly, well, I'll say it like this, not exactly true. And that's why I think they leave it in, because it is somewhat true. Okay, and you'll see why in a minute. But because they thought that you could accept the blood by hand, they left it off. Then when they realized they couldn't, so in the later Mishnah, they put in, well, by the way, it's the same as the others. But they still left it originally not in the topic sentence. So let's try to understand this even better because it's quite confusing. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Vilakach. Okay, so now you have to go to Vayikra chapter 14. And there it talks about the process. And it says he slaughters the animals. And then it says he slaughters the keves from Kamashish Chatatachatav Ve'atawala. Okay, the keves is for the Asham. Ki kachatata ashamhu. Okay, you slaughter it in the same place because the asham is like a sin offering. We're going to come back to this line. Okay, and this is kodesh kodeshim hu. Velakacha kohen midam ha'asham. Now he takes from the blood of the asham. V'natano tnuch ozen mitahera yimani v'abon yado yimani v'abon raglo yimani. Right? Presumably after he does the placings of the blood, then what does he do? He takes the blood and he puts it, we know this, on the ear and the finger and the toe of the leper. Then it says, that's the lakach we're going to darshan. Okay, but now, after he finishes that, what does he do? We talked about this also. And he takes from the oil, takes a log of oil, and then he puts the oil, pay attention, in the hand of the kohen. He dips his finger, his right finger, into the oil, which is on his kapoah smalit. It's one of the avodas he has to do in his left hand because he can't, right? He has to hold it in his left hand because he can't. I'm a lefty, so I'm doing a flip. He has to hold it in his left hand and dip his finger in the right hand because there's no other way to do it, right? Because he can't not do something with his left hand here because he needs two hands. Anyway, that's not important, but what happens? Now, that clearly he takes the oil in his hand. And there it also says velakach, and then he takes and puts his finger. Now, what's missing in the blood is it never says his hand and it never says his finger. It just says he takes, right, velakach from the blood and he puts it. Velakach v'natan. But it doesn't say that he dips his finger. It doesn't say he puts it in his hand. So velakach, yachol b'kli. You might think it's with a vessel. Talmud lomar v'natan. Now they assume because he has to put it, how does he put it if not with his finger? So since he does that with his own finger, we thought, now how'd they get that he does it with his finger? Because of the oil. The oil's with his finger, it must be this is with his finger, and since he's doing that with his finger, we assume he also put it in his hand. So, from there they learn the blood is in his hand. And that actually is true. But what? There's two bloods. There's bloods he puts on the altar, and there's bloods he puts on the ear and the nose and the ear and the finger and the toe. So yachol af lemizbeach. You might have thought also for the altar. Talmud lomar ki kachatat ashamhu. That's the pasuk just before, which says the asham is like the chatat. Ma chatat tuna kli af asham ta'un kli. So they both need a vessel. So now we're going to say, and here's the summary. Nimtzet ata'omel asham mitzorah shnei kohanim mekablim et amo. That's how it works. Two kohanim get the blood. Echad biyad ve'echad b'kli. Now we understand maybe why they didn't say kodesh kodesh shchitam tzvah. It's not just because they thought that maybe the blood was all collected by hand and then realized they were wrong, but it's more than that. It's that there's two collections of blood. One is by hand, one is with a vessel. Zeh shekiblo b'kli, the kohen that gets it in the vessel, balo etzel mizbeach, he brings it to the altar. Zeh shekiblo b'yad, balo etzel mitzorah, and the one who gets it by hand goes to the leper. So because of that, they didn't want to put the topic sentence, that explains it. Okay, so again, the answer is either because they thought at first and were mistaken, but then that's a little weird. Why would they leave it in? But it seems because it's complex. Because there are two takings of blood, and they don't want people to be confused, and therefore they didn't say all of these because there's going to be that exception to the rule. So, summary of today's daf. We started with this issue of mitasek, of doing something l'shem, right? The mishum chulin, thinking it was chulin, which is different than in the name of chulin. Okay, a sacrifice that you're doing is a sacrifice, but in the name of chulin, that's okay. Although maybe you won't be yotze your obligation, but as chulin is a problem, that's what we call mitasek. And then we talked a little about mitasek, and then from there we got to this machloket between the people in our Mishnah versus Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosi, about who can be mefagel the korban. A good ending to the whole pigul, or maybe we should have started there. Who does the pigul? And then Abaye connected two other machlokot with it, and then we talked about how much they're connected, who would necessarily hold with who, and what's the order. From there we got to Ezu Mukoman Shel Zevachim, and we started with the first two categories of it, and then really the Gemara just dealt with this line, this topic sentence, and why is it missing the Klei Sharet B'Tzafon. And with that, and that's all because of the Asham Mitzorah, the one case that has a minor exception to the rule. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.